we had this guest speaker, Lowell Diller, wildlife biologist, come to our class to talk about the work he was doing, which at the time involved killing one owl, the barred owl, to save the spotted owl from extinction. And he was like pretty upset about it. He shared the first time he had to kill a barred owl, he had like an emotional breakdown. He could barely pull the trigger.
Okay, so that's how we're starting today. Welcome to Treehugger Podcast, the show about ecological restoration where we cover stories about justice, human health, and livelihoods in a warming world. I'm Michael Yadrick, podcasting from Tacoma, aka Grit City, on the ancestral lands of the Puyallup people. This is also a show about interrogating the words we use before we reach for a shovel, or a sprayer, or apparently a rifle. Now, before anyone panics, this episode is not anti-restoration. I work in restoration. I love restoration. I have built parts of my identity around restoration. But I also believe we should be able to laugh nervously at ourselves when we say things like, we're managing ecosystem health. Oh, really? Are we? What exactly is ecosystem health? Is it biodiversity, carbon sequestration, shade equity, soil microbial activity? Is it aesthetic preference? Is it grant eligibility? Maybe all of the above. But health in ecology can mean everything and nothing at the same time. It's one of those words that sounds so good it almost shuts down inquiry. And that brings me to today's guest. Clare Follman is an environmental writer and educator based in Olympia, Washington, just down Interstate 5 for me. She holds a master's in environmental studies from the Evergreen State College. Yes, that Evergreen. Home of the social contract, which explicitly protects the freedom to express minority viewpoints. Maybe I hold it up with some nostalgia on a pedestal because that's where I went to undergrad, but the school basically says, please question everything, especially the thing everyone agrees on. Clare's graduate work examines scientific rhetoric in the invasive species narrative, and that research became her book, Scapegoat, What the Invasive Species Story Gets Wrong, published by AK Press. And let me acknowledge something. I have done a lot of episodes on displaced species. I generally thought I had exhausted the topic. We've talked garlic mustard, we've talked knotweed, we've talked militaristic metaphors, we've talked just language. I'm almost ready to retire the theme. But then Clare and AK Press drops a book that threads invasive species rhetoric through capitalism, colonial land policy, plastic words, climate migration, and the ethics of killing. And I was like, fine, one more. Because Clare doesn't just say, maybe don't call plants invasive. She says, what if the entire story functions as scapegoating? What if we are blaming species for the outcomes of extraction, trade, and climate disruption? Basically, we're just bailing water out of a sinking boat instead of turning off the tap. She also talks about the weak potential for true eradication, the fantasy that if we just spray harder, shovel faster, legislate stricter, we can rewind ecosystems to some stable pre-disturbance baseline. But ecosystems aren't static. They are responsive, dynamic, disturbed. In a warming world, a lot of places are becoming novel ecosystems, whether we like it or not. So what does restoration mean in that context? Purity, nostalgia, harm reduction, and adaptation really come into question. And here's where it gets spicy. Invasive species rhetoric often relies on militarized language. We battle, we combat, we eradicate, target, control. That vocabulary seems kind of familiar, doesn't it? That same language shows up in right-wing political rhetoric about immigration, borders, and belonging. Now, to be clear, plants are not people. Ecological harm is real, but metaphors travel. And once you normalize a story about invaders contaminating a pure homeland, the story can migrate across domains very easily. Clare handles this with nuance. She doesn't equate restoration with fascism. She's saying language shapes imagination, and imagination shapes policy. We also talk about tools, herbicide and guns and shovels. Not very many of us carry guns and kill owls, but we tend and balance the ecosystem. We use shovels, and herbicides are a tool we often rely on as well for invasive species management. So these are not abstract ideas. They are real interventions with ethical weight. In some cases, they may be justified. In others, they may be easier than confronting the larger economic drivers of disturbance. Which brings us to capitalism. Because it's a lot easier to spray a plant than to dismantle a growth economy, it's a lot easier to remove species than to reform trade systems. It's a lot easier to write a management plan than to write, we need to rethink how we build housing, consume lumber, and burn fossil fuels. Clare's book argues that invasive species narratives often function within a capitalist framework that treats land as a resource, disturbance as anomaly, and movement as threat. Meanwhile, climate refugees, the human and non-human, are becoming the norm. Species are shifting ranges because temperatures are shifting, and some people are moving seed and plants around. People are moving because droughts, storms, sea level rise, and policies are reshaping where life is viable. So what happens when our dominant ecological story is built around purity and control? Some people get silenced. Clare draws on the concept of plastic words, terms that sound scientific and authoritative but stretch to mean almost anything. Words like management, development, health, like I mentioned earlier, risk, sustainability. These words can signal objective science while obscuring very personal cultural values. They can close conversations in public meetings, they can silence community knowledge, they can hide political choices behind technical phrasing. And I think that matters because restoration is not just about plants, it is about livelihoods, about public health, about who gets shade in heat waves, about who breathes cleaner air, who has access to green space, whose labor is involved, and whose voice counts. So yes, this episode is about invasive species, but it's also about novel ecosystems in a warming world, the ethics of killing and conservation, the ambiguity of ecological health, the limits of eradication, the relationship between capitalism and conservation, and how we might practice restoration with more humility and clarity. Clare is so thoughtful, grounded, not dogmatic. She works in sustainable agricultural education. She writes with precision. She asks uncomfortable questions without collapsing into cynicism. I'm grateful my favorite press published this book because sometimes we need critical analysis that pokes at the dominant story. Recently, I've been asking the Treehugger guests to complete this sentence. Restoration is blank. This conversation might not give us a clean, clear answer, but it definitely complicates the blank. So get ready, here it comes. And if you get a chance, check out the show notes. There's lots of resources there. And Clare added to the Treehugger playlist. One of my love languages is sharing music, so please check out the Treehugger Lightning Songs playlist. Talk to you on the other end.
Hi, I'm Clare Follman. I live in the Pacific Northwest and I work in sustainable ag education. I got my master's in environmental studies at the Evergreen State College. I'm an author and environmentalist, and my first book, Scapegoat: What the Invasive Species Story Gets Wrong, is coming out with AK Press on March 3rd. My writing tends to revolve around themes of ecology, language, politics, and philosophy, and I like to poke holes in dominant narratives and uplift the stories and voices from those too often cast aside, especially from the non-human world.
Yeah, shout out to our friends at AK Press. They're super cool. It's my favorite press. Can't move forward with the podcast without talking about them. So
Yeah, they're great.
the book is coming out March 3rd. In the opening, you show how invasive species management relies on war metaphors and technical language. This is not a new theme to Treehugger podcasts. Both of us have some origin stories out of Evergreen. Evergreen has a social contract about protecting minority opinions. I don't know if that background shaped your willingness to question such a strong, dominant ecological story about invasive species.
Yeah, no, I actually did not know about that social contract, but I do think the culture of the school definitely does empower students to question and challenge dominant perspectives. But actually, it was my first class at Evergreen. It was actually a prerequisite class before my program started. So it was before I really had a sense of the culture at Evergreen, where I first started questioning the whole invasive species management story. But we had this guest speaker, Lowell Diller, wildlife biologist, come to our class to talk about the work he was doing, which at the time involved killing one owl to save another owl under the banner of invasive species management. I think a lot of people listening will probably be sort of aware of that controversy, the owl versus owl controversy. But for those who aren't, this experiment was to kill the barred owl, considered an invasive species in the Pacific Northwest, originated in eastern North America. Yeah, to kill the barred owl to save the spotted owl from extinction. And so the thing is, like, logging really was enemy number one regarding spotted owl population decline because logging destroys spotted owl habitat. But some perspectives were shifting. And so Diller was doing this experiment to see if killing barred owls in particular areas would help spotted owl population come back. And when he was talking about his work, he was like pretty upset about it. He like was very vulnerable and shared that like he hated killing barred owls. He spent his whole career learning to revere raptors, and now he had to kill barred owls. And it really was hard for him. And he shared the first time he had to kill a barred owl, he had like an emotional breakdown. He could barely pull the trigger. The conclusions Diller and others drew from this experiment were a bit of a stretch, and that Diller was actually employed by a very big timber company, Green Diamond, at the time of the experiment. And logging still remains the biggest threat to spotted owl population decline. But at the time, it was really his anguish and like frustration around this work he had to do, killing these barred owls, that made me wonder, is this really the best plan we have available for this sort of conservation? So yeah, that's really what started me questioning the dominant story around invasive species.
Yeah, I don't know if most people are even familiar with this story, and I'm a little murky on it too. I'm sure it's really difficult to shoot owls, maybe
Yeah.
versus like pulling out plants out of the ground, I guess. Maybe
Yeah,
it
I
feels
think,
different as a person.
yeah, it really is. It's a lot harder, I think, to kill an animal than to pull out a plant. There might be better ways of taking care of ecosystems that don't necessarily involve those measures. They recently, in 2024, while I was working on my book, they passed this barred owl management plan to kill close to 500,000 barred owls in the Pacific Northwest over the course of 30 years to try to protect spotted owl habitat. So the experiment had long-lasting impacts that we're seeing today. And there's, obviously a lot of controversy, I think, about this plan, but it's still considered the best plan available.
And versus like shutting down logging operations
Right.
across the
Exactly.
Northwest, right? So
Yeah.
I get it. Yeah, and I think you also read about science's very much complicated relationship with language and public trust, and you specifically call out framing and using sciencey words like management or control or even the word health as plastic words.
Hmm.
And to me, even this is very much like the vernacular of ecology. These words sound very clear and responsible, but they can really obscure a lot because their origins originate like in business or finance and somehow like environmentalism has co-opted these terms. So what do these words make us stop noticing about owls or plants and ecosystems? And what kinds of better questions could we ask if we slowed down and unpack them?
Yeah. So yeah, what do you think about when you hear the word management?
For me, like if I hear someone in my own like world, in my own community of practice and use
Hmm.
the word management related to like a tree or forest management or weed management, I pretty much know what they're talking about. But
Hmm.
if I step outside of my bubble and so if someone says like water management from a different profession or maybe like a cardiologist or like even a doctor uses that term, like I'm kind of lost, I guess.
Yeah. No, then there's so many different types of management, right? There's human management, economic management, land management. It sounds good, right? Managing things, that's usually a good thing. It has this kind of sense of hierarchy, maybe, right? Managers are kind of in charge of like employees. It's got a bit of sterility and it's confusing though, for sure. And there's like other plastic words like development or progress or plan. They all have kind of a similar vibe. And I feel like they also seem inevitable. So then I'm going to give you an example of a sentence with a lot of plastic words. I'm going to ask you to guess what you think it means or who wrote this sentence. Okay. It goes, we seek to manage these resources sustainably with the objective of maintaining their environmental, social, cultural, and economic value. What do you think that means?
Oh man, it's so crazy because like I have this degree that uses many
Right.
of those terms. So unpacking them all and in the fashion you sort of strung them all together, yeah, I have no idea. I think you used the word resource, right?
Mm-hmm.
Did you?
Yeah.
Which resource are you talking about?
Yeah.
The human resource, a
Right.
plant resource. So as you're referring to like something living or non-living, like what is it?
Mm-hmm.
So in my mind, it ends the conversation almost.
Yeah.
Like I go a little hazy.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
kind of lose track. It's almost like a mic drop, just for lack of a better cliche.
Yeah. Sounds like something good is being done, right? There in this sentence, we've got managing resources sustainably, even, and at the same time maintaining the environmental, social, cultural, and economic value. I'm being a little tricksy because this is just one sentence, and perhaps in context you would be able to understand what it means. But so that sentence comes actually from the West Fraser Timber Company's website. They're a timber company based in Canada, and they have broken a lot of environmental laws, caused a lot of pollution, and have failed actually 66% of environmental inspections from 2018 to 2022 and have had to pay penalties upwards of $50,000. So, like in this particular case, the bureaucratic phrasing here with all these plastic words essentially just means we're going to clear cut ecosystems and horribly pollute the environment, right? And so I feel like these words, they can hide capitalist agendas behind the banner of good or inevitable ideas. It's not to say land management or these words are always implying something bad. Like land management can mean something good, like certain forms of indigenous land stewardship, right? So that's really the issue, is that they're not always bad. These words are not implying something wrong or evil or bad or problematic or environmentally ecocidal, but they do often obscure what is being meant and what is being done. And so when we're using these sorts of words, it's just really important to be very careful and define them. Explain what you mean when you say land management. What does that mean in this case?
In the spirit of plastic words, I actually like stopped using the word invasive for like
Mhm.
just about like a year.
Yeah.
Like it was like a word. And when you go to ecology type symposiums or meetings, that word just comes out. Like it came out in a meeting yesterday I had like dozens of times. And I was like, where did y'all learn this term?
Mhm.
And it was related to a native plant.
Oh, interesting.
To their credit, it was talking about poison oak.
Okay.
Yeah, but I've started to inspect the messaging in print or on media, like on the websites
Mhm.
or even like in everyday language, particularly like when I'm talking to neighbors, when people's eyes just start to glaze over, I think a lot of the time it's like because of the wording we're using. So
Yeah, no, definitely. We do all use these plastic words, right? I use them, you use them. I'm not saying don't use them. It's really the issue of like being able to define them and making sure you're really clear about what you're talking about when you use them.
I guess what are some better questions we could ask? Like, how do we untangle? How do we stop using these words?
Yeah, and again, it's okay if we use them, but I do think there are better questions that can use more clear language when we're thinking about ecosystems and species relating in those ecosystems. One question can be, how does this species relate in this ecosystem? Or are there overabundant species? And in what ways are they harming or helping the ecosystem? Are the pros of this particular overabundant species, do they outweigh the cons of that species? What do I not know? For example, could be a good question to ask. Have I connected with this ecosystem long enough to understand what it really needs and how it's working with the species in it? What sort of natural phenomenon benefit this ecosystem and how can I support that? Really humble and like non-human centric questions, I think, are going to be better than how can we develop the plan to manage this land in ways that maintain the cultural value of the resources. When confronted with the plastic word mumbo jumbo, I think the question you should always be asking is like, what does this mean? Sometimes it's going to mean something fine and good or whatever, and sometimes it's going to mean environmental pollution, developing or clear cutting an entire ecosystem to build like apartment buildings. Figuring out what these words mean, it's going to take a little work and a little research, but I think it's worth it to understand what is being done and what is being said.
In the middle of the book, you argue that invasive species narratives are tied to capitalism, colonial history, and ideas about who belongs where. How do you see those forces shaping ecological language, and what gets hidden when we blame quote unquote bad species instead of naming systems like extraction and displacement?
Obviously, xenophobia, fear of the other, the idea of belonging here versus there. These are really tight in the popularized discourse around invasive species management. But I guess I also think about the history of forest ecology. There was this idea that snags or dead trees were garbage and they were removed. This was common practice, but we now know that trees offer more life and biodiversity when they're dead than when they're alive. In Atlanta, for example, one of the reasons they pushed for the development of the cop training center, a member of city council explained that the forest, the Wilani forest, parts of it they were going to cut down to build cop training center, was because he thought the forest wasn't what he would consider a forest because it had invasive species in it. And so you get this idea of garbage nature. It's ruined. It's not ideal according to people who have these maybe outdated perspectives around ecosystems. And I think that a forest, even if it's got some invasive species that are causing some problems, that's going to be so much better and so much more environmentally beneficial than, a city cop training compound. I also think about when herbalists talk about maybe plants not being useful if they're not useful to people. And I think the idea that for something to matter, it has to matter to people is sort of embedded in a colonial and capitalist mindset and the idea of nature as a resource to be extracted from. And then in invasive species management specifically, I've heard people call invasive species monsters and celebrate and take pleasure in killing them or eradicating them. Aside from parallels to xenophobia, I feel like the gleeful slaughter of the natural world does echo a colonial mindset. Even if invasive species cause environmental damage in certain cases, I feel like this myopic villainization of them is really bizarre and really sad. Invasive species don't have an agenda. They're just trying to live in new ecosystems that some people move them to on a planet undergoing climate crisis and capitalist development, where people are now trying to kill them and then maybe celebrate in killing them. So I feel like the invasive species story is just really tragic and a little ironic. So yeah, what gets hidden when we blame invasive species instead of naming systems like extraction and displacement? I think the root cause of these ecological problems we're facing. And this is why I named my book Scapegoat, because I feel like invasive species are villainized and spectacular invasive species management that we're seeing is really distracting from the root cause of ecological problems, namely capitalism. I use this invasive species management analogy to describe issues I see with invasive species management. It's like you're in the garden and you're trying to get rid of some bindweed or dandelions or ivy. You wouldn't just cut the leaves of those plants off, right? Because if you just cut the leaves, they'll grow back because you didn't dig out the root, right? That's what you really need to do if you're going to pull these plants out of your garden. So similarly in invasive species management, I feel like you could kill all the invasive species in the world, but you would still face problems of extinction and messed up ecosystems and climate crisis because you haven't addressed the root of the problem of capitalism.
In my mind, it's like we blame quote unquote bad species, maybe because we're allowed to. Maybe we feel like we have more control over them, but we don't have control over capitalism, colonial history, and certainly some corporations just obfuscate like the real reasons of extinction or decline of desirable species. The biggest thing for
Yeah.
invasive species is people will be like, oh, it's taking up space that we want other species to take up. I guess what we feel like we have agency over.
Yeah. And actually this is something I think about a lot. In the current political, cultural, environmental climate, there's so much out of our control and things keep getting worse in so many different ways. And I feel like there's this zine I really like. It's called We Are All Very Anxious. And it talks about this. Like when you have that sense of being out of control, not being able to know what's going to happen next, predict hopeful outcomes, and you have this fear and anxiety about the world in general, a natural response is to just crack down on things that you can control. Like maybe you clean a lot, or maybe you do a bunch of cancel culture stuff, or maybe you scapegoat invasive species for causing environmental degradation, or you really believe in recycling or something. And so we take these small things that we can have some sort of human intervention or control. We take them we put a lot of importance on them. And if obviously the issue there is that we're not actually addressing the systemic change, and we're spending a lot of energy and time doing these small menial things that are ultimately either drops in the bucket or at worst detrimental to working towards better ways of caring for each other and the land.
I agree. Some folks, you named yourself as environmentalists, like very peaceful people, right? But we've been trained to a certain extent to like judge which things belong in our neighborhood, which things belong in our ecosystem, and just a turn of a dial or whatever the cliche is, like all of a sudden just this hate kind of spews out, and it mimics this very political, like right-wing rhetoric about control of immigration a lot of the times,
Yeah,
I think.
no, definitely,
And I don't
100%.
know if and I think you mentioned this in the book, and I glommed onto it, but I thought about yeah, multiple times, all the time.
For sure. I feel like it's really frustrating, right? And there's this like kind of sick irony because, in the case of invasive species management, they're in these ecosystems because some people put them there. And in the case of this whole bigoted, xenophobic hatred of Mexican migrants into the US, Bill Clinton worked with Canada and Mexico to create NAFTA, right, which eliminated tariffs between those countries. And this really messed up the economy of Mexican farmers. And so it created the situation of poverty and destitution for a lot of Mexican farm workers. And it forced this immigration to other places where there's less poverty. And so it's in both the cases, I feel like agents of the state are like really quick to blame people or species for being where they were forced to move or brought to. It's really frustrating.
Yeah, the trickle down policies that were decades ago, it feels like our collective memory is a little short
Mhm,
sometimes. So
mhm.
let's say there is a new story for displaced species, one that's less about good and bad and more about reciprocal relationships. So, of all the research you did, is there any different approaches that departs from our big eradication projects and becomes more responsive, more caring to how we interact with quote unquote invasive species?
Yeah, so I think the example that I immediately think of really gets more at the framework and mentality that I think is important to bring to invasive species management or really any sort of conservation or restoration work. And so in my book, I talk about this study where Anishinaabe researcher Nicholas Rayo and anthropologist Laura Ogden explored the concept of invasive species with members of the Anishinaabe tribe. And some members of the tribe who were interviewed definitely recognized certain issues and problems and dangers with invasive species in new ecosystems, but many others really felt the need to recognize a sort of inherent kinship that people have with the non-human world, and that like all beings deserve respect. And so some ideas that some Anishinaabe people had for like tending to ecosystems with invasive species in them, aside from like physical and biological removal in certain cases, really involved engaging with ecosystems with a mentality of care, with really clear and focused observation, and with respect, and really emphasize the importance of looking to how other species related with invasive species in the ecosystem to be able to better understand the bigger picture. And there was this like sort of emphasis to not judge these invasive species for things beyond their control. And by and large, there was like much more of a concern around the idea of like an invasive land ethic that imposes Eurocentric ideas of property and control when it comes to the land, and which sort of emboldened the idea that people are separate from nature. So I'm pretty inspired by a lot of Indigenous land stewardship practices. Indigenous people care for over a quarter of the world habitat, which is by and large healthier and has more biodiversity than land not cared for by Indigenous people. And I think connecting with people and the cultural traditions that have tended to the land is really important in general, and especially now as we're facing climate catastrophe and mass extinctions. And these practices can, of course, look different from tribe to tribe and ecosystem to ecosystem. And what has worked in the past may not work in the future or even now. And so when I'm talking about being inspired by Indigenous land stewardship, I'm not just saying like, do whatever the people native to the ecosystem you live in were doing to that ecosystem before colonization. because that can slide pretty quickly into like culturally appropriation territory, but also because climate crisis and colonialism and capitalism have really irreparably altered the world, right? And ecosystems are different and need different modes of care. And so like when I'm talking about Indigenous land stewardship, I'm really getting at the importance of connecting to the non-human world in a relational way. And in my book, I talk about Potawatomi tribal member Kyle White, who explores ideas of Indigenous knowledge, which again will vary from tribe to tribe, but he pulls out this sort of common theme where Indigenous knowledge is like in part based on carefully observing and connecting to and communicating with and learning about the relationships between people, non-human species, and ecosystems. And it really gets at this idea that people are a fundamental part of nature. And I think relating to nature in this sort of non-human centric, non-hierarchical way is diametrically opposed to dominant capitalist frameworks that are ruining our ecosystems.
I love those authors. Yeah, Kyle White, Nick Rio. I don't think they're listening to the podcast. Hopefully they are. We appreciate you all. Laura Ogden. I feel like that was instrumental for me a couple years ago, kind of grappling with the sort of relationship piece with, I think, language being the portal, for me anyway, towards a better relationship with the more than human world.
Yeah.
Is there any other tips you have for folks operating within these systems we're all swimming in?
Yeah.
I know, again, like we're not going to solve everything
Right.
today, and not to give toxic optimism out there, but just think it was some imagination and responsibility a little bit more, because it seems like you thought about it with this book.
Yeah, it's funny because I had a friend who was offered a job in invasive species management, and she texted me and asked me for advice on why she should turn it down. And I just want to say, like, I do understand we need jobs and we're not necessarily going to love everything about them. So I didn't, dissuade her from taking the job. Leftists, radicals, anarchists, communists, just like empathetic people, we're all going to be participating in activities on a daily basis that go against our morals and ethics. So I do recognize that tension. But at the end of the day, I think a global capitalist society is always going to be a problem. And we should always be working towards other ways of relating with each other and the planet beyond capitalist frameworks. Capitalism relies on pretty much eternal extraction of resources from the earth for profit. And this can't work forever on a finite planet. But I do think capitalism will end. And I think engaging in other practices, behaviors, relationships with each other and the world in ways that are anti-capitalist, and at the same time helping build anti-capitalist movements, momentum, and infrastructure is something that we can all be doing right now. This practice of planting seeds of the new world or new societies in our existing one, this is known as dual power or prefiguration. And so the idea is that if or when capitalism ends, the foundation of a better world will already be in place and growing. But for like maybe less extreme, long-term, hopeful, optimistic, idealistic examples, I do think people in these sorts of fields related to the natural world and gardening and conservation and climate crisis and all that, aside from like developing those important relationships with the natural world, I think it's really important to challenge dominant perspectives when you have issues with those dominant perspectives, right? I think we're in this time where our ideas of best practices for conservation and land management and ecosystem restoration, they're changing. And so many things are going to be outdated. And I think if we're involved in these spheres and fields of work, we really need to take notice, observe, develop those relationships, and challenge these dominant perspectives. This is how we stopped removing snags from the forest because we thought it was garbage nature, right? Or we started using soap in hospitals. It was from challenging conventional wisdom. And so I think that is a really important thing we can be doing within and beyond our fields of work.
That was a good role you're on. Yeah, I like that. You said prefiguration.
Prefiguration and dual power.
I've never heard that word before, but that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
I've thought about it in terms of like these protected areas or whatnot. To a certain extent, they're only quote unquote protected because there's these imaginary lines drawn around them. And so the institution or the municipality or the county or whatever, just they're protected now. But in late stage capitalism, who knows who's going to own or be tending that land later on. That's the way I think about it sometimes with invasive species. Like we're removing this wood that at some point someone might need to be building something because we don't have this flow of capital of like lumber, let's say. We might run short on 2x4s at some days. But somebody may need that for medicine, or a lot of people treat invasive species like garbage. No one likes to have regrets, but looking back on it, we've eradicated all the tree of heaven or something. It's keeping our neighborhoods cool. So it'd suck to look back and be like, oh, we got rid of all those trees that we didn't like. Now we're missing them. You want to do some rapid fire questions?
Okay.
So could you finish this provocation? Restoration is blank.
How about restoration is idealistic?
Love it. Do you have a favorite tree?
I think right now I'm really thinking a lot about big leaf maple because I always make big leaf maple fritters in spring.
I think I know what those are. Can you explain real quick?
Yeah, I'll drop the
What those
recipe.
are?
When the big leaf maple starts blooming, they create these really lovely, vibrant green clusters of flowers. And what I like to do is pick maybe like 8 at a time at most. And then you bring them home, you wash them off, you dip them in like pancake batter or waffle batter or make your own batter or whatever. And then you fry them and you've got these really delicious, crunchy, not too sweet little cakes, fritters, maple blossom fritters. And I feel like a little fairy whenever I make them. I think they're a delicious fairy food and they're crunchy and you can taste the nectar in them. Anyway, maple blossom fritters. They're great.
Okay, I know I've heard about them, but I've never made them. I feel like I always miss the flowers too. So I don't know. They're out for a couple weeks, month or so.
No, yeah, you have to jump on them when they're there.
Do you have a plastic word that you can't seem to get rid of? You can't seem to stop using?
A lot of them. I think maybe my favorite one is probably relationship. I definitely have used that a lot in this conversation, and I use that a lot. I do try to explain what I mean by relationship when I use it.
I have this one with health too.
Yeah.
We use that word health a lot, and that showed up on your list. And it's weird too. The etymology is it's like a Germanic, like it's not Latin. I don't know if that makes a difference, but like Latin words seem to be more like fancy and a little more obscure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, not a linguist, but somebody could tell us more about that one. Are there any quote unquote invasive plants you think that are most unfairly judged? Or one you secretly admire for its persistence?
I'm always really inspired by any plant that can grow through the sidewalk. That's always kind of hopeful and heartening for me. In terms of like invasive species that have the most unfair judgment, I definitely feel like the barred owl is up there, especially right now.
I'll put some links about the barred owl controversy in the show notes. Also, in the book, he talked about not only plastic words, but metaphors and how sometimes they're not super helpful. Any example of a metaphor you'd happily retire forever?
Yeah, whenever the theory of evolution is used as a metaphor, especially when it comes to like people or societies.
Like survival of the fittest?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yep.
And I've been making this playlist for a while. It's growing. I don't know if people are really listening to it. Do you have a song to contribute?
Yeah, I already had a song based on, the nature of your podcast, and I'm just gonna use that one even if it doesn't vibe with all the other songs. But Jethro Tull's "Songs from the Wood," I feel like is a good one.
All right. Okay, yeah. I'll add that one.
Okay.
Well, thank you for your time this afternoon, this rainy afternoon. It's very classic PNW.
Yep.
Wintertime.
Yeah, thank you
happily indoors
for having me on my first podcast ever.
Of course. I know you're going to go on to bigger and better podcasts, so I'm glad we caught you.
Oh, hush.
I appreciate your time. I love your book.
Thank you.
So, super cool. It's great to meet you.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, that was a good one. Claire, thank you. Appreciate you writing the book, for being willing to question language that many of us, myself included, have used for years without much friction. And thank you for doing it with care instead of contempt. I think that's important. It's easy to dunk on institutions. It's harder to work inside them and still ask better questions. To the listeners, especially those of you working in ecological restoration, urban forestry, conservation, environmental education, thank you for sticking with these conversations. If you're new to Treehugger, welcome. If you go back into the archives of Treehugger, I know this topic can feel a little repetitive. I've done a lot of episodes circling around invasive species rhetoric. I generally thought I had wrung the sponge dry, and then Clare came along and twisted it one more time. The takeaway for me isn't stop restoration. It's not throw away your shovel. It's not herbicide equals fascism. Well, maybe. It's more subtle than that. It's this. Be precise. If it's harmful, describe the harm. If you mean shade, say shade. If you mean the thing, say the thing. And if you find yourself reaching for a word like, quote unquote, health, pause and ask what the word is carrying. Language doesn't just describe the world, it organizes it, it allocates funding, it assigns blame, it silences some voices and amplifies others. Real restoration deserves clarity. We are in a warming world, species are moving, people are moving, dominant systems are under strain. The work ahead will require imagination, humility, and hopefully fewer war metaphors. So thank you all for helping to widen that blank. It's helping us reimagine restoration together. I'm grateful for y'all listening, thinking, and continuing to show up for your communities. If you'd like to go deeper into these ideas, I write semi-regularly at Grove and Grit, my Substack where I explore restoration language, sometimes love, and the politics of land in a little more long-form way. I'd love to see you there. And if this podcast has been meaningful to you, if it's helped you think differently or given you language for something you felt but couldn't name, consider supporting me. Treehugger is independent. It runs on curiosity, community, and occasionally late-night editing sessions. Right now, for example, it's 7:42 p.m. on a school night. You can donate, share the episode, leave a review, or simply send it to someone who still says combat invasive species with a straight face. As always, I'm grateful you're here. Until next time, see you in the woods.